Step away from her wheelchair, ma'am. We've had 3 complaints about you loitering in this lobby, Officer Rusk, ma'am. We've had 3 complaints about you loitering in this lobby. Same thing every Tuesday. You sit, you don't buy anything, you make the other residents uncomfortable here. Apartment 4C, I'm waiting on my granddaughter. That's what they all say. Sergeant Maddox planted himself behind her chair, one hand braced on the vinyl backrest like he was about to push it somewhere she hadn't agreed to go. We're going to need you to vacate the premises, ma'am, before this becomes a trespassing matter. I have a key. I have a lease. I've lived in this building 11 years. Then you won't mind showing us your ID. She reached for her purse with hands that had gone stiff in the cold lobby air, and that was when Lieutenant Colonel Malik Dawson set down his coffee and rose from the bench by the mailboxes, slow and deliberate, the way a man rises when he has already decided something and is only waiting for his body to catch up to his mind. That woman has done nothing but sit in a chair in her own building, he said. Take your hand off the back of it. Neither officer recognized the quiet man in the gray fleece jacket as a 26-year veteran who had once commanded an entire battalion, and neither of them had any idea that the woman they were threatening to drag out into the December cold had spent the last 4 decades of her life keeping a secret that would soon turn both their careers and her own completely upside down. Before this story goes any further, drop a comment with the city you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because what happens to Officer Rusk by the end of this one is going to make you want to watch it twice. Dorothy Mae Whitfield's morning had started, as it always did, at 5:10 a.m., a full hour before her alarm, because her body had never learned to sleep past the hour she used to wake for the early shift at the federal courthouse downtown. She lay in the dark of her 1-bedroom apartment, listening to the radiator tick and complain, and she thought, the way she thought every morning now, about how strange it was that a body could retire even when the mind absolutely refused to. Her name was Geneva Holt, though almost nobody in the building called her that anymore. To the mail carrier she was ma'am. To the new property manager she was the lady in 4C who's behind on nothing but somehow always under suspicion. To her granddaughter Aliyah, who was 17 and lived 2 bus transfers away with Geneva's son-in-law, she was Grandma G, and that was the only name that still felt like it fit. She'd worked 31 years as a court reporter for the Eastern District, transcribing testimony in a windowless room while lawyers argued, and judges sighed, and defendants either wept or stared at the ceiling fan like it owed them an explanation. She had typed words into the official record that sent men to prison and words that set them free, and not one soul in that courthouse had ever once raised their voice at her, because everyone, even the meanest prosecutor in the building, understood that you did not mess with the woman who controlled the only true account of what had been said. Then her knees had gone. Then the building had been sold to a management company headquartered in a state she'd never visited. Then the rent had crept up 9% in a single year, and the new tenants in the building were younger, whiter, wealthier, and looked at her in the elevator like she'd wandered in from a different building entirely. She pressed her palm flat against her left knee, feeling the grind of bone on bone that no amount of physical therapy had managed to quiet, and she eased herself upright in the dark. The eviction notice was not on her table. That was the strange mercy of her situation. She paid her rent on the 1st of every month, by check, the way she'd paid it for 11 years, and she had the carbon copies to prove it going back further than that. But the notices that did sit on her kitchen table were almost worse, in their way, because they were vaguer and meaner. 3 formal complaints in the building's tenant portal in the last 2 months: loitering in common areas, disruptive behavior toward staff, concerns regarding unauthorized visitors. She had read them so many times she had them by heart, the way she used to have testimony by heart before she'd even finished typing it. She had not had a single unauthorized visitor. She had not raised her voice at staff. She sat in the lobby on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons because that was when her son-in-law, Theo, dropped Aliyah off on his way to his second job, and the lobby had the only bench with a view of the street. From the next room came the small sounds of her granddaughter still asleep on the pullout. Aliyah stayed over twice a week now, ever since things at her father's apartment had gotten complicated in ways Geneva understood better than the girl knew. The girl mumbled something into the pillow, turned over, went quiet again. 17 years old and already carrying more weight than most grown men, Geneva had watched testify in federal court. Geneva made her way to the kitchen in the dark, the hardwood cold under her bare feet, and put on the kettle for tea, because coffee did something to her stomach these days that coffee never used to do. The refrigerator hummed its old complaint. Inside there was a carton of eggs, a heel of bread, and a Tupperware of greens she'd made stretch across 4 days now. She had a pension, modest but real, and Social Security, modest but real, and between the two of them, and the new building fees that had appeared on her statement with no explanation attached, the math worked less and less every month. On the counter sat Alia's school bag, one strap nearly torn through at the seam. Geneva found the sewing kit in the drawer, where she kept things that still had use left in them, and stitched the strap by hand under the stove light, the way her own mother had taught her to mend things instead of throwing them away. Waste not, want not. Her mother's voice, 40 years gone, still showed up at 5 in the morning sometimes, in moments exactly like this one. She checked the clock. 5:50 a.m. She had 2 hours before she needed to be downstairs because Tuesday was the day she helped Mrs. Okafor from 2B carry her groceries up from the lobby, ever since Mrs. Okafor's hip surgery, and Geneva had never in her life been the kind of woman who let someone struggle alone if she had 2 working arms and time to spare. She did not yet know that this particular Tuesday would be the day. Officer Rusk decided, once and for all, that an elderly black woman sitting quietly on a bench in her own apartment lobby constituted a threat that required intervention. The lobby of the Brennan Court Apartments had the kind of manufactured elegance that newer buildings paid consultants to design. Gray stone tile, a gas fireplace that ran year-round whether anyone needed warmth or not, an arrangement of fake eucalyptus in a vase too tall for the side table. Geneva had watched the building transform around her over 11 years, the way a person watches a familiar face age in photographs, each change small until you stacked them all together, and realized you were looking at someone else's home now, wearing the shell of yours. She took her usual seat at 1:45, settling her bag beside her, the worn leather one Theo had given her the Christmases after her daughter Renee passed. She did not see the new property manager, a brisk young woman named Kayla Voss, watching her from behind the front desk with an expression Geneva had learned, over decades of reading rooms for a living, to recognize as suspicion dressed up as professionalism. At 2 Kleis, 2 patrol officers came through the front doors, not in response to any call Geneva was aware of, walking with the loose-shouldered confidence of men who had been told they were going somewhere they were wanted. "That's her," Kayla Voss said, low, not quite low enough, same as last week. Officer Rusk was younger, with a buzz cut and a way of chewing gum that made his jaw work even when he wasn't speaking. His partner, Sergeant Maddox, was older, heavier through the shoulders, with the unhurried gait of a man who had never once in his career imagined himself in the wrong. They crossed the lobby directly toward her. "Ma'am, we've gotten some complaints," Rusk said, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. "About you sitting here. Loitering." "I live here," Geneva said, the same words she'd said the week before, and the week before that. "Apartment 4C. That's what we hear a lot," Maddox said, not quite smiling. "Folks like to say they live somewhere when they get caught somewhere they shouldn't be. I'm not caught anywhere, Sergeant. I'm sitting on a bench in my own building, waiting on my granddaughter. We're going to need to see some ID," Rusk said. She had her ID. She had her lease. She had, tucked in the same wallet, a courthouse badge from 31 years of federal service that she still carried out of habit, though she did not reach for it, because some old, tired part of her was curious. Genuinely, bitterly curious. How far this would go before anyone in that lobby bothered to ask her a single real question. She reached for her purse, and Maddox's hand came down on the back of her wheelchair-style walker, not gripping it hard, but proprietary, the way a man touches something he has already decided belongs to someone else's authority and not hers. "Take your hand off my chair," Geneva said, and for the first time her voice had an edge in it, 31 years of courtroom steel rising up through the tired body of a 68-year-old woman who had asked, politely, 3 times now, to simply be left alone. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice. I haven't raised it." That was the moment Lieutenant Colonel Malik Dawson rose from the bench across the lobby, where he had been sitting with a paper cup of coffee from the deli on the corner, waiting on the elevator repair crew to finish so he could get up to his sister's unit on the 9th floor. He was 61, broad through the chest, in the particular way of men who had spent careers carrying packs that would break a younger back, with close-cropped gray hair and a stillness about him that made people in rooms quiet down without quite knowing why. "Sergeant," Dawson said, "that woman has done nothing in front of me except sit in a chair and ask you to take your hand off it." Maddox turned, sizing him up the way men like Maddox always did. Height, build, the calm in his face that read to a certain kind of officer as either harmless or dangerous, with no room in between. "This isn't your business, sir. I'm making it my business. Sit back down before you turn a misunderstanding into something worse." "I'm trying to let an elderly woman sit in her own lobby in peace," Dawson said. "Which one of us is doing the worst thing here?" What neither officer knew, what nobody in that gray stone lobby knew except Geneva herself, and what she had not said out loud to a soul in this building in 11 years, was that the woman they were threatening to remove for trespassing held somewhere in a fireproof box in her closet a set of documents that would, within the week, end one of their careers and put the other under federal review. And what Dawson did not know, as he stood between an elderly stranger and two officers twice his patience, was that the woman he had just defended sat on the board of a federal judicial oversight committee that had, 2 months earlier, begun a quiet, unannounced investigation into exactly this building, this management company, and the pattern of complaints filed against its oldest, longest-tenured, most inconveniently rent-controlled residents. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back," Rusk said, hand drifting toward his belt in a gesture so practiced it barely registered as a threat to him, though it registered, instantly and completely, to everyone else in the lobby. "I'm a retired Army officer standing 6 feet from you with my hands visible," Dawson said evenly. "I am not the one you should be worried about touching." Kayla Voss, behind the desk, had her phone out now, not calling for help, but filming, the particular reflex of a person who has just realized a situation is about to become a problem for someone and wants to make sure it isn't her. "Ma'am," Maddox said, turning back to Geneva, his patience visibly thinning, "are you going to show us identification, or are we doing this the hard way?" Geneva opened her purse with hands that did not shake, though her heart was going hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, and pulled out her wallet and laid 3 things on the side table next to the too-tall vase of fake eucalyptus. Her driver's license, her lease agreement folded into quarters from being carried for 11 years, and a laminated card she had not shown anyone in this building since the day she moved in. Maddox picked up the laminated card first because it was gold-embossed and official-looking in a way the others weren't, and his face did something complicated when he read it. "This says Federal Judicial Center," he said slowly. "Office of Court Reporting Standards. I worked for the federal courts for 31 years, Geneva said. "I know exactly what trespassing looks like, Sergeant, because I have transcribed 11 trespassing trials in my career, and what you are doing right now does not meet a single element of it." Maddox set the card down. He did not apologize. He did the thing men like him often did instead, which was to recalibrate his posture without admitting anything had changed, and say, "We'll note this was a misunderstanding," in a tone that suggested the misunderstanding belonged entirely to her. Rusk, younger and less practiced at retreat, was not finished. "That doesn't change that we've had complaints. Multiple complaints. From who?" Dawson asked. "That's not something we share. It's something a federal oversight board will absolutely share," Geneva said quietly. And something in her voice made both officers go still. "When they request the tenant complaint log for this building, which I expect they will, given the pattern." Kayla Voss, behind the desk, lowered her phone an inch. The officers left without another word, the lobby doors swinging shut behind them, with a soft pneumatic hiss that felt, to Geneva, both like nothing at all and like the end of something she had been bracing for, in one form or another, for 11 years. Dawson crossed the lobby and sat down beside her. Not too close, the careful distance of a man raised to respect a stranger's space even in the act of kindness. "You all right, ma'am?" "I'm tired," Geneva said honestly. "I'm so tired, son. You have no idea." "I think I might have some idea," Dawson said, and something in the way he said it made her look at him properly for the first time. Really look the way she used to look at witnesses on the stand, reading the things underneath the words. "My name's Malik Dawson. I'm visiting my sister upstairs, Geneva Holt," she said. "Fourth floor. 11 years. 11 years, and they're treating you like you just walked in off the street. They've been treating me like that for 2 months now, ever since the new management took over the complaint system." She folded her lease back into its careful quarters. "I think they want this building to look a certain way, Mr. Dawson, and I am not the way they have in mind." "Colonel," Dawson said, then caught himself, the old habit of correction surfacing before he could stop it. "Sorry. Force of habit. Just Malik is fine. You don't sound like a man who lets people just call him by his first name." A small, tired smile crossed his face, the first one she'd seen since he stood up from that bench. "No, ma'am, I suppose I don't." He did not yet know that the woman beside him, quiet, dignified, carrying a federal oversight badge in her purse like it was nothing more than an old library card, was about to change the entire trajectory of his week. And Geneva did not yet know that the stranger who had stood up for her, in a lobby full of people who chose to look away, was about to become the only ally she had inside a building, determined to push her out before anyone noticed what was actually happening. That night, after Aliyah had gone to sleep on the pullout, and the apartment had gone quiet except for the radiator's familiar complaints, Geneva sat at her kitchen table and opened the fireproof box she kept in the back of her closet, behind the winter coats nobody wanted anymore. Inside were 31 years of carbon copies and case numbers, the small private archive of a woman who had spent her career being the only honest record in rooms full of people lying to each other. And tucked among them, more recently, were photocopies of every tenant complaint filed in the Brennan Court portal over the last 6 months. Complaints she had requested, formally, in her capacity on the Oversight Committee, after noticing a pattern in her own building that troubled her long before 2 officers showed up to confirm it. Of the 41 complaints filed in the last 6 months, 38 had been filed against tenants over the age of 60. Of those, 31 were original rent-controlled leaseholders, the kind whose monthly payments had not kept pace with the market rate the new management company desperately wanted to charge. Mrs. Okafor in 2B, recovering from hip surgery, had been cited for obstructing the hallway with her walker. Mr. Pruitt in 7A, 83 years old, had been cited for suspicious loitering, for sitting on the bench outside his own door reading the newspaper. And Geneva Holt in 4C had 3 complaints in 2 months for a crime that amounted to sitting quietly in a lobby waiting for her granddaughter. She had seen patterns like this before, in transcripts, in testimony, in the careful, bloodless language men used in depositions when they wanted to push someone out of a building, a job, a neighborhood, without ever once using a word that could be quoted back to them in court. She recognized the shape of it, the way she recognized her own handwriting. What she had not expected, in 11 quiet years of minding her own business and paying her rent on the first of the month, was to become the proof of it herself. The following morning, her phone rang before 7, the screen showing a number from the property management's corporate office. The voice on the other end was smooth, apologetic in the specific, careful way of someone who had been coached on liability. "Mrs. Holt, this is Janelle Caro from Brennan Court Property Solutions. We wanted to follow up on yesterday's incident in the lobby. I'd be happy to discuss it. We're actually calling to let you know we've decided not to renew your lease for the upcoming term. We feel, given the pattern of disturbances, that it may be best for all parties if you sought housing elsewhere." Geneva sat very still at her kitchen table, the same table where she had mended a torn backpack strap and read 41 tenant complaints the night before, and felt something she had not felt in 31 years of courtroom work. Not surprise, because she had seen this coming since she'd first opened that fireproof box, but a kind of cold, focused clarity that used to come over her right before she typed the final line of a verdict. "On what grounds," she said, "are you declining to renew a lease I have honored, on time, in full, for 11 consecutive years?" As he said, the pattern of disturbances. "The disturbance yesterday was 2 officers harassing me in my own lobby based on a complaint your office filed without my knowledge, against a federal judicial standard that requires documented cause. I would like that cause in writing, today." There was a pause on the other end, The small silence of someone realizing the woman they were speaking to was not going to go quietly, was perhaps not built to go quietly at all. "I'll have to escalate this to our legal department." "Please do," Geneva said. "And while you're at it, escalate it to Judge Renata Sloane's office at the Eastern District Courthouse. Tell her Geneva Holt called. She'll know exactly what it's about." She hung up before the woman could respond, and sat for a long moment in the quiet of her kitchen, hands folded on the table the way she used to fold them at her transcription station, while a courtroom waited on her to finish typing the truth into the permanent record. By that afternoon, Malik Dawson had come back to the building, not to visit his sister this time, but because something about the gray stone lobby and the woman who'd been threatened in it had stayed with him overnight in a way few things did anymore. He found Geneva in the lobby again, sitting in her usual spot, though this time with a folder of documents spread across her lap instead of waiting for her granddaughter. "You're back," she said. Not quite a question. "I called my sister this morning, told her what happened. She told me 3 other tenants in this building have had the police called on them in the last 2 months. He sat down beside her again, the same careful distance. "I did some digging. The company that bought this building, Vantage Residential Holdings, they've got a pattern. 5 other properties, all converted to market rate within 18 months of acquisition, all in neighborhoods that used to be majority black, majority working class." "You did some digging," Geneva repeated, a small note of something like respect entering her voice. 26 years in the army, you learn to read a pattern before it finishes forming. "I commanded a logistic battalion for the last 6 of those years. I know what it looks like when someone's running people out by attrition instead of force, because it's cheaper and it's harder to sue." Geneva looked at him for a long moment, weighing something. Then she opened the folder on her lap and turned it so he could see. "I sit on the Federal Judicial Center's Oversight Committee for Court Reporting Standards," she said. "It sounds like nothing, I know. But part of my role, since I retired, is reviewing patterns of bias complaints that intersect with housing and civil rights litigation referred from the federal courts. I've been tracking Vantage Residential for 4 months, Colonel Dawson. I just didn't know I lived in one of their buildings until they bought mine out from under me, 11 years after I moved in." Dawson sat back slowly, recalibrating the woman in front of him, the way Maddox had recalibrated his posture the day before, except where Maddox's recalibration had been defensive, Dawson's was something closer to awe. "You're not just a tenant they picked on by accident," he said. "No, son. I think I might be the one tenant in this building who was always going to be a problem for them, the moment they bothered to look closely enough to find out who I used to be." That evening, the eviction notice that had not existed 2 days earlier arrived, official and certified, citing non-renewal of lease due to repeated disturbances and tenant complaints, with 30 days to vacate. Geneva read it twice at her kitchen table, the way she used to read testimony twice before typing the final transcript, and felt the particular, familiar grief of a woman who has done everything right her entire life and is being punished anyway for the crime of growing old and inconvenient in a building someone else wanted to make new. Alia found her there an hour later, the notice still on the table between them. "Grandma, what is that?" "Nothing you need to worry about, baby. It says eviction. That's not nothing." Alia sat down across from her, 17 years old, and already too good at reading rooms, the same gift Geneva had spent her career using, and had apparently passed down without ever meaning to. "They can't do that. You've lived here longer than I've been alive. They can try, baby. People with money and lawyers try things every day that they have no right to try. Then what are we going to do?" Geneva looked at her granddaughter, at the torn backpack strap she'd mended the morning before, at the tired set of a teenager's shoulders that should never have had to learn what eviction notices looked like, and felt something harden in her chest that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with 31 years of sitting silently in rooms while other people decided the fate of people who looked like her. "We're going to do what I did every single day for 31 years in that courthouse," Geneva said. "We're going to make sure the record shows exactly what happened, all of it, in order, with dates." The following week unfolded faster than Geneva had expected, the particular acceleration that happens when a quiet woman who has spent her career documenting truth finally decides to use that skill on her own behalf. She filed a formal complaint with the Federal Judicial Center's Housing Discrimination Liaison Office, attaching the pattern data she'd compiled. 41 complaints, 38 against tenants over 60, 31 against original rent-controlled leaseholders, a near-perfect map of who Vantage Residential Holdings wanted out of their building and who they were willing to leave alone. She reached out to Mrs. Okafor in 2B and Mr. Pruitt in 7A, both of whom had quietly assumed their complaints were isolated incidents, both of whom went pale and then furious when Geneva showed them the pattern laid out in black and white. Malik Dawson, it turned out, had connections of his own. A logistics officer's network ran deep, and within days he had put Geneva in touch with a tenant rights attorney named Priscilla Vance, who had successfully sued 2 other Vantage-owned properties in neighboring counties for exactly this pattern of age and race-correlated displacement. And Judge Renata Sloan, when Janelle Caro's legal department finally did escalate the matter, as Geneva had known they eventually would, took exactly 1 phone call to remember precisely who Geneva Holt was. The woman who had transcribed her courtroom for 14 years without a single error flagged on appeal, the woman whose name carried more weight in that courthouse than half the attorneys who argued in front of her. The eviction notice was rescinded within 10 days, quietly, without apology, the corporate equivalent of pretending it had never been sent at all. But Geneva was no longer interested in quiet. She requested, and was granted, a public tenant hearing before the city's Housing Oversight Board, the kind of hearing that almost never drew attendance beyond the handful of tenants directly affected. This one drew a local news crew, alerted by Priscilla Vance, and a packed room of Brennan Court residents who had spent 2 years assuming their individual complaints were isolated bad luck rather than corporate strategy. Geneva stood at the podium, stood despite her knees, because some things deserved to be said standing, and read the pattern into the public record the way she had read 10,000 pages of testimony into the federal record over 31 years, plainly, completely, without embellishment, because the truth had never once needed her help to be damning. Officer Rusk's body cam footage from the lobby incident, subpoenaed by Vance's office, showed exactly what Geneva and Dawson remembered. An elderly woman sitting quietly, asked 3 times for identifications. She had never refused to provide, threatened with removal from her own home on the word of a property manager who had filed the complaint herself. Rusk was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review. Sergeant Maddox received a formal reprimand and a mandatory retraining assignment. The department's quiet way of saying it had no intention of losing an experienced officer over what it still privately considered a misunderstanding, even as the city's Housing Oversight Board considered it something closer to a pattern of racially coded policing requested, paid for, and directed by a property management company with a financial incentive to see elderly black tenants gone. Vantage Residential Holdings settled with the affected tenants of Brennan Court 11 weeks later, under threat of a class action that Priscilla Vance had assembled with a speed that surprised even Geneva. The settlement included 2 years of frozen rent for all original leaseholders, a formal apology that nobody believed but everyone insisted on having in writing anyway, and the removal of every complaint filed against a tenant over the age of 60 in the preceding 18 months. Kayla Voss, the property manager who had filed the original complaint and watched the whole confrontation unfold from behind her desk with a phone in her hand, was no longer employed at Brennan Court by the time the settlement was announced. Geneva did not gloat. She had never been a woman who gloated, even in 31 years of being right about things in rooms full of people who didn't want her to be. But she did, on the evening the settlement was finalized, sit at her kitchen table with Alia and Malik Dawson, who had become, somewhere in the last 11 weeks, something between a friend and a son she hadn't expected to gain at 68, and pour 3 cups of tea, and feel, for the first time in 2 months, that the building around her finally belonged to her again. "You could have just moved," Dawson said, stirring his tea slowly. "Found somewhere quieter, somewhere that wanted you." "I thought about it," Geneva admitted. "More than once, in the middle of the night, I thought about it." She looked toward the window, toward the building's old brick facade visible across the courtyard, the same brick she'd watched for 11 years. But I spent 31 years making sure the record was honest for everybody else's life but my own. Seemed like at some point somebody needed to do the same thing for mine. For what it's worth, Dawson said, I'm glad I was in that lobby. For what it's worth, Colonel, Geneva said, allowing herself finally the smile she'd been holding back for weeks. So am I. 6 months later, the city's Housing Oversight Board, citing the Brennan Court case as a catalyst, passed a new ordinance requiring management companies to disclose the demographic breakdown of tenant complaints filed in any building seeking a non-renewal pattern above a certain threshold. A small, bureaucratic, unglamorous change that would, in the years to come, make it measurably harder for what had happened to Geneva Holt to happen quietly to someone else. Aliyah, who had watched her grandmother stand at a podium and read a pattern of injustice into the public record without raising her voice once, decided that spring to apply to law school, telling anyone who asked that she wanted to learn how to do exactly what her grandmother had done for 31 years without anyone ever calling her a hero for it. Keep the record honest, and trust that the truth, properly documented, was the most dangerous thing in the room. And in the lobby of Brennan Court, on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, Geneva Holt still sat on the same bench, waiting for her granddaughter, no longer watched by anyone with suspicion, because the building had finally learned what its oldest tenant had known about herself the entire time. That dignity, once written into the record, was very hard to erase.